They called it the soft underbelly of Europe. Winston Churchill promised it would be a swift campaign, a shortcut to victory that would bring the Nazis to their knees. Instead, it became one of the most brutal, costly, and soul-crushing battles of World War II, from July 1943 to May 1945. Allied forces fought their way up the spine of Italy in what would become a nearly 2-year nightmare of blood, mud, and mountain warfare. This is the story of the Italian campaign, a battle that cost over 500,000 casualties, destroyed ancient cities, and saw some of the most savage fighting in the European theater. This is a story of heroism and tragedy, of tactical brilliance and devastating mistakes, of soldiers from every corner of the globe fighting through hell itself. This is the story that history almost forgot. The Mediterranean, 1943, the North African campaign had just ended in Allied victory. General Erwin Rommel's vaunted Afrika Korps was crushed, and over 250,000 German and Italian soldiers had surrendered. The question facing Allied commanders was simple but critical: what next? In the smoke-filled conference rooms of Casablanca, Morocco, in January 1943, a fierce debate raged. The strategic disagreement would shape the course of the war. On one side stood the American military chiefs, led by General George C. Marshall. Their vision was clear and uncompromising: a direct assault across the English Channel into France. Strike at the heart of Nazi Germany through Northern Europe. Anything else, they argued, was a dangerous distraction that would delay the inevitable showdown with Hitler. On the other side was Winston Churchill, the British Prime Minister who had stood alone against fascism when all seemed lost. Churchill saw a different path, one that led through Italy. He called it the soft underbelly of Europe, a vulnerable point where Allied forces could strike a decisive blow against the Axis powers. Churchill's arguments were compelling. An Italian campaign would knock Italy out of the war entirely. It would force Hitler to divert precious divisions from the Eastern Front, relieving pressure on the Soviet Union, whose armies were bleeding white on the frozen steppes of Russia. It would secure the Mediterranean Sea completely for Allied shipping. And most tantalizing of all, it might open a pathway through the Alps into Austria and straight into the heart of Germany itself. But the Americans remained skeptical. They saw the Mediterranean as what one general called a sideshow, a campaign that would consume resources better used elsewhere. The memory of World War I's Italian front, where hundreds of thousands had died in senseless mountain battles, haunted their thinking. Yet there was a practical consideration that couldn't be ignored. In early 1943, the Allies simply weren't ready for a cross-channel invasion. The massive buildup of men, ships, planes, and supplies needed for D-Day would be complete until sometime in 1944. What would happen in the meantime? Would Allied troops sit idle in Britain for over a year while Russians died by the millions on the Eastern Front? The compromise was struck. The Allies would invade Italy, but it would be a limited campaign, a way to keep pressure on Germany while preparing for the main event in France. It was a decision that would have profound and bloody consequences for hundreds of thousands of young men who would fight in Italy's mountains. First, though, they would need to take Sicily. July 9, 1943. Under cover of darkness, the largest amphibious operation of the war up to that point was about to begin. Operation Husky would see 160,000 Allied troops assault the beaches of Sicily. An operation even larger in scope than the D-Day landings that would come a year later. General Dwight D. Eisenhower commanded the overall operation. Under him, General George S. Patton led the American 7th Army landing on Sicily's southern coast, while British General Bernard Montgomery's 8th Army would strike the southeastern shores. Together, they formed the 15th Army Group under British General Harold Alexander. The landings caught the defenders by surprise. Despite rough seas that scattered many gliders and paratroopers, the amphibious assault proceeded with remarkable success. By the end of the first day, thousands of troops had established beachheads and were pushing inland. The Italian defenders, already demoralized and weary of Mussolini's war, offered little resistance. Many surrendered en masse, their hearts no longer in a fight they believed was already lost. But the Germans were a different story. Elite divisions like the Hermann Göring Parachute Panzer Division fought with their characteristic ferocity. making the Allies pay in blood for every mile of Sicilian soil. The race was on to capture Messina, the strategic port on Sicily's northeastern tip that controlled the narrow strait to the Italian mainland. Montgomery's methodical advance along the eastern coast was slowed by determined German resistance and the island's rugged terrain. Patton, ever the aggressive commander, saw an opportunity. On July 22, Patton's forces captured Palermo, becoming the first American troops to liberate a city in World War II. The local population poured into the streets, waving white flags and welcoming their liberators. But the campaign's most important objective remained ahead: Messina.
The statistics of the Italian campaign paint a grim picture. By the winter of 1943-44, casualties among infantry forces were proportionally higher than they had been on the Western Front in World War I. The comparison is staggering. The Italian campaign was more deadly, more brutal than even the horror of the trenches at the Somme and Passchendaele. Weather became as much an enemy as the Germans. Freezing rain, snow and mud made movement nearly impossible. Supply lines were stretched to breaking. Soldiers lived in water-filled foxholes, their clothes never dry, their feet rotting with trench foot. Cases of combat exhaustion skyrocketed. And still, the order was to attack January 22, 1944. While Allied forces battered themselves against the Gustav Line, Winston Churchill pushed for a bold flanking move. If the Allies couldn't break through at Cassino, they would go around it. Operation Shingle called for an amphibious landing at Anzio, a quiet beach resort town 30 miles south of Rome and 55 miles behind the Gustav Line. The plan was elegant in its simplicity: land a force in the German rear, cut their supply lines, and force them to abandon the Gustav Line, or be trapped between two Allied armies. The commander of the operation, Major General John P. Lucas, was far from optimistic. He called the plan an extremely risky undertaking, and privately wrote in his diary, "That it had a strong odor of Gallipoli." Referring to the disastrous World War I amphibious assault that had cost the Allies over 250,000 casualties, Lucas had good reason to worry. The force assigned to him initially just 2 divisions. About 50,000 men seemed woefully inadequate for such an ambitious operation. The landing site was surrounded by mountains from which German artillery could rain down fire. And if the Germans reacted quickly, the entire force could be trapped on a tiny beachhead and annihilated. The initial landing went almost flawlessly. German forces were caught completely off guard. By midnight, on January 22nd, 36,000 soldiers and 3,200 vehicles had come ashore. Allied casualties were minimal, just 13 killed and 97 wounded. It was an achievement that seemed too good to be true. And it was. Lucas, cautious by nature and mindful of what had happened at Salerno, chose to consolidate his beachhead rather than strike immediately inland toward Rome. For 2 critical days, while the road to Rome lay practically undefended, Allied forces dug in and waited for reinforcements. Field Marshal Kesselring could hardly believe his luck. He had been caught flat-footed, with almost no forces between Anzio and Rome. But now he had time to react. German divisions rushed to contain the beachhead from northern Italy, from France, from other sections of the Gustav Line. Within days, the Allies found themselves surrounded by 40,000 German troops. Within a week, that number had grown to 70,000. The trap had slammed shut. What was supposed to be a daring stroke had become a siege, too. When Lucas finally did order an offensive on January 30th, it was too late. American forces attacking toward Cisterna ran straight into prepared German defenses. 2 battalions of elite U.S. Rangers, attempting to infiltrate the town at night, were ambushed at dawn. Caught in open ground with no cover, over 700 Rangers were killed or captured in one of the most devastating single losses suffered by MTR American Special Forces in the entire war. The British attack toward the village of Aprilia which soldiers grimly nicknamed the factory, made initial progress but was soon bogged down in savage close-quarters combat. The village changed hands multiple times, each assault costing hundreds of casualties. On February 16th, the Germans launched Operation Fish Fang, their massive counteroffensive, to drive the Allies into the sea. What followed was 4 days of some of the most intense fighting of the entire war. German tanks and infantry pushed the Allied line dangerously close to the beaches themselves. Artillery fire was so concentrated that soldiers described it as worse than anything they had experienced, including veterans of the Eastern Front. But the line held. Allied artillery, firing at point-blank range, decimated the attacking German formations. Naval gunfire from offshore added its weight to the defense, too. The battlefield at Anzio was tiny, just 18 miles long and 9 miles deep. German artillery on the surrounding hills could reach every square inch of it. Soldiers called it Hell's Half-Acre and the world's largest self-sustaining prisoner of war camp, echoing Axis Sally's propaganda broadcasts. There was nowhere to hide. Shells fell constantly, day and night. Soldiers dug deeper into the earth, living like moles in underground bunkers. Disease was rampant. The mosquito-infested marshes bred malaria that would eventually account for 37,000 non-combat casualties. An astonishingly high number. A Navy nurse at Anzio later wrote, "The shelling never stops. We work in underground wards by candlelight. Men die faster than we can count them. And every day, we wonder if today is the day the Germans break through." For 4 months, from January to May 1944, the Anzio beachhead remained locked in this deadly stalemate. It achieved none of its objectives. Far from forcing the Germans to abandon the Gustav Line, it had tied down 6 Allied divisions that could have been used elsewhere. Final tally at Anzio was staggering. 43,000 Allied casualties, including 7,000 dead. German casualties were approximately 27,500. But the true cost was measured in opportunity. The chance to break the Italian stalemate had been squandered, while Anzio festered as an open wound. The Gustav Line remained unbroken. And at its heart stood Monte Cassino, the mountain that would become the symbol of the entire Italian campaign's brutality. Between January 17th and May 18th, 1944, the Allies would launch 4 major assaults on Monte Cassino. Each would fail at tremendous cost. The mountain would earn names that spoke to its horror: Murder Mountain, Massacre Mountain, the Graveyard.
First battle, January 17th, February 11th, 1944. The first assault began with an attempt by the U.S. 36th Infantry Division to cross the Rapido River. What followed was one of the most catastrophic single engagements for American forces in the entire war. On the night of January 20th to 21st, American soldiers attempted to cross the swift, icy waters under cover of darkness. They carried assault boats and bridging equipment through mud under heavy fire. German machine guns, pre-sighted on the river crossings, opened up with devastating effect. Boats were riddled with bullets and sank. Men were swept away by the current or cut down in the water. Of the 4,000 men who attempted the crossing, over 2,000 became casualties within 48 hours. Entire companies ceased to exist. The survivors who made it across were isolated and quickly overwhelmed. It was a disaster that would lead to investigations and recriminations for years afterward. French colonial troops, fighting on the northern flank, showed what was possible. Moroccan Gumirs, mountain warfare specialists, infiltrated the German lines through terrain deemed impassable. They advanced further than anyone else, but without support, they too were driven back. Second battle, February 15th to 18th, 1944. By February, Allied commanders faced a terrible decision. The Abbey of Monte Cassino, that ancient symbol of peace, dominated the battlefield. Rumors spread that Germans were using it as an observation post. Though these reports were false, the Germans had scrupulously avoided occupying the abbey itself. But Allied commanders convinced themselves that the abbey had to go. On February 15, 1944, Over 250 American bombers dropped 1,400 tons of high explosives on the monastery. For hours, wave after wave of bombers reduced the magnificent structure to rubble. Some 250 Italian civilians taking shelter inside were killed. The monks miraculously survived. The bombing was both a military disaster and a cultural tragedy. The Germans, who had not been using the abbey, now occupied the ruins, which provided excellent defensive positions. The bombing had accomplished nothing except the destruction of a priceless historical site and the creation of better defensive positions for the enemy. New Zealand and Indian troops launched assaults following the bombardment, but they were thrown back with heavy losses. The German Fallschirmjäger, fighting from the ruins, proved more deadly than ever. Third Battle, March 15th to 26th, 1944. The third battle began with another massive bombing raid. On March 15th, Allied aircraft dropped 1,250 tons of bombs on the town of Cassino itself, utterly destroying it. What had been a medieval town became a moonscape of craters and rubble. Then came the assault. New Zealand troops fought their way into the devastated town, engaging in brutal house-to-house combat among the ruins. The Mbori Battalion of the New Zealand forces made a heroic assault on the railway station, suffering over 150 casualties in the attempt. Engineers trying to clear paths through the flooded, cratered terrain for armor support couldn't keep up. Canadian and British troops joined the assault, but the ruined town, paradoxically, became even more defensible. Every pile of rubble was a machine gun nest. Every crater was a fighting position. The destruction had worked in the defenders' favor. After 11 days of savage fighting, the third battle ended in failure. The New Zealand and Indian divisions, fought to exhaustion, were withdrawn. The toll was staggering, thousands more casualties, and Monte Cassino still stood unconquered. Fourth Battle, May 11th to 18th, 1944. For the final assault, the Allies assembled overwhelming force. Operation Diadem would involve 4 Corps 15 divisions, over 300,000 men attacking along a 32-kilometer front. The artillery bombardment that preceded the attack involved over 1,600 guns, the heaviest concentration yet seen in the Italian theater. At 11 p.m. on May 11, 1944, the artillery opened fire. For hours, shells rained down on German positions. Then came the infantry assault. This time, attacking from multiple directions simultaneously, the Allies finally began to break through. French colonial troops, including Moroccan and Algerian soldiers, made crucial gains in the mountains to the south. British and Canadian forces pushed forward. American troops advanced from Anzio, finally breaking out of their prison beachhead. But the honor of taking Monte Cassino itself fell to the Polish, the Second Corps, led by General WWII Anders. These were soldiers with a special hatred for the Germans, men who had seen their homeland crushed in 1939, who had endured Soviet captivity, who had traveled halfway around the world for a chance to fight back. The Poles launched their assault on May 12th against the most heavily fortified positions on the mountain. The fighting was apocalyptic. German artillery and mortar rained down fire. Machine guns cut down entire platoons. The Poles attacked again and again, taking horrific casualties. On May 17th, the final assault began. Polish soldiers of the 12th Podolski Regiment and the 5th Kresowa Infantry Division fought their way up the slopes, through minefields and wire over the bodies of their fallen comrades. On the morning of May 18, 1944, Polish soldiers reached the summit of Monte Cassino. The Germans had withdrawn during the night. Kesselring had finally ordered a general retreat to avoid encirclement. But the victory was a hollow one for the men who reached the top. They found a few wounded German soldiers unable to travel and a landscape of utter devastation. The Polish flag and British Union Jack were raised over the ruins at 10:30 a.m. Over 900 Polish soldiers had died in the battle. The cemetery that stands there today bears testament to their sacrifice. The price of Monte Cassino was almost incomprehensible. Allied casualties, 55,000 killed, wounded, and missing. Lieutenant General Mark Clark would later write, "The battle for Cassino was the most grueling, the most harrowing, and in one respect the most tragic of any phase of the war in Italy. With the Gustav Line finally broken and Anzio forces breaking out, the road to Rome lay open. But here, one of the most controversial decisions of the campaign occurred. General Mark Clark, commanding the Fifth Army, was given clear orders: cut off the German 10th Army retreating from Cassino and destroy it. This was the moment to deliver a knockout blow to trap and annihilate the German forces that had caused so much suffering. But Clark had his eye on a different prize. He wanted the glory of liberating Rome, of being the first Allied general to capture an enemy capital. Against explicit orders, he turned his forces northwest toward Rome instead of east toward the escaping Germans. On June 4, 1944, Clark's forces entered Rome. The city was relatively undamaged. Kesselring had declared it an open city to avoid its destruction. Romans poured into the streets, celebrating their liberation. Clark got his triumph, his moment in the international spotlight. But the cost was immense. The German 10th Army, which should have been destroyed, escaped to fight another day. Kesselring's forces withdrew northward in good order, already preparing their next defensive line. Clark's moment of glory lasted exactly 2 days. On June 6, 1944, the Allied armies landed in Normandy. Operation Overlord, the long-awaited invasion of France, had begun. Overnight, Italy became a secondary theater, a sideshow that newspapers barely covered. 7 divisions were withdrawn from Italy to support operations in France. The Italian campaign, once envisioned as a path to victory, was now officially just a holding action, a way to tie down German divisions that might otherwise be sent to France or Russia, but the fighting in Italy was far from over. Kesselring had prepared another defensive line, the Gothic Line in the northern Apennines. Once again, Allied forces would have to assault prepared mountain positions. Once again, they would pay in blood for every mile. The Gothic Line battles of late 1944 and early 1945 would see more bitter fighting, more mountains to climb, more rivers to cross. The weather turned foul again. Rain, mud, and snow made operations nearly impossible. Progress was measured in yards, not miles. Spring 1945. In Germany, the Reich was collapsing. Soviet armies were closing on Berlin from the east. American and British forces were crossing the Rhine from the west. The end was near. In Italy, the final offensive began on April 9, 1945. Allied forces, now including the battle-hardened Brazilian Expeditionary Force, launched a massive assault on the Gothic Line. German resistance, though still fierce, was crumbling. The Wehrmacht was running out of men, fuel, and ammunition. On April 21st, Allied forces broke through into the Po Valley, the fertile plains of northern Italy. The German retreat became a rout. Allied aircraft strafed the retreating columns mercilessly. On April 25, 1945, Italian partisans rose up across northern Italy. In cities and towns, these resistance fighters who had waged a brutal guerrilla war for years emerged from hiding. German soldiers, cut off and surrounded, surrendered by the thousands. Benito Mussolini, attempting to flee to Switzerland with his mistress Clara Petacci, was captured by partisans near Lake Como on April 27th. The next day, he was executed by firing squad. His body, along with that of Clara and other fascist leaders, was taken to Milan and hung upside down in the Piazzale Loreto, where crowds gathered to mock and mutilate the corpses. On May 2, 1945, 1 week before the formal German surrender, German forces in Italy surrendered unconditionally. Nearly 1 million German soldiers laid down their arms. It was the first major German force to surrender, and it came 1 day after Hitler's suicide in his Berlin bunker. The war in Italy was over. The Italian campaign of World War II remains one of the most controversial operations of the war. Was it worth it? Could the resources have been better used elsewhere? These questions continue to be debated by historians today. The costs were staggering. Between September 1943 and May 1945, Allied casualties, over 330,000, including approximately 60,000 to 70,000 dead. German casualties, over 330,000, excluding the final surrender. Italian civilian deaths, over 150,000. Italian partisan casualties, approximately 35,000. Thousands of irreplaceable cultural sites destroyed or damaged. Some historians argue that the campaign served a crucial purpose. It tied down German divisions that could have been used against the Soviets in the east or against the D-Day landings in France. At various points, Germany had more divisions fighting in Italy than the Allies did, making Italy a German problem as much as an Allied one. Others contend that the campaign was a strategic dead end. The difficult terrain made rapid advances impossible. The resources consumed in Italy might have enabled an earlier invasion of France, potentially shortening the war. What cannot be disputed is the courage of the men who fought there. Soldiers from America, Britain, Canada, India, Poland, France, Morocco, Algeria, New Zealand, Brazil, and many other nations fought in Italy. They endured conditions comparable to the worst battles of World War I, mountain warfare and brutal weather, against a skilled and determined enemy fighting from nearly impregnable positions. The Polish soldiers who finally took Monte Cassino, the American Rangers annihilated at Cisterna, the British troops who held at Anzio, the Moroccan Guerriers who climbed mountains deemed impossible, the New Zealand Boer battalion that suffered devastating losses, the Brazilian soldiers who fought in the mountains. Each of their stories deserves to be remembered. The Italian campaign also saw Italian civilians caught between armies. Over 150,000 died in the fighting. Ancient cities like Cassino were completely destroyed. The Abbey of Monte Cassino, standing for nearly 1,500 years, was reduced to rubble in hours. The cultural loss is incalculable. And for Italy itself, the campaign brought not just liberation but civil war. Italian partisans fought against German occupiers and Mussolini's puppet regime. Italian soldiers of the co-belligerent army fought alongside the Allies against their former German allies. Approximately 35,000 Italian troops fighting for Mussolini's Social Republic were killed. The wounds from this period took generations to heal. Winston Churchill called Italy the soft underbelly of Europe. But as General Mark Clark discovered, that underbelly had teeth. The Italian campaign became a grinding war of attrition, a test of endurance rather than maneuver, a battle that consumed armies and spat out broken men. The campaign ended not with a dramatic final battle, but with a whimper German forces surrendering to an enemy that had finally, after 20 months of brutal fighting, ground them down. Berlin had already fallen. The Reich was no more. Today, the Commonwealth War Graves Commission maintains beautiful cemeteries across Italy where tens of thousands of Allied soldiers rest. At Monte Cassino, the Polish cemetery stands on the slopes where so many died. In Anzio, British and American cemeteries hold the remains of those who fought on that bloody beachhead. The Abbey of Monte Cassino was rebuilt after the war, reconstructed stone by stone using the original plans. Today it stands again on its mountaintop, a symbol of resilience and peace. But the scars of war remain visible in the Italian landscape. Bunkers and defensive positions still dot the hillsides, silent witnesses to the battles fought there. The Italian campaign may not have the fame of D-Day or the Eastern Front, but for those who fought there, it was hell on earth. It deserves to be remembered not as a sideshow or a strategic mistake, but as what it truly was: one of the most difficult, costly, and hard-fought campaigns of World War II, from Sicily to the Gothic Line, from Salerno to the Po Valley. Hundreds of thousands of men fought and died in Italy. Their sacrifice and the lessons learned from this brutal campaign helped shape the final victory over Nazi Germany. This was the Italian campaign, the forgotten bloodbath that helped win World War II. Thank you for watching. If you found this video informative, please like and subscribe for more World War II documentaries. What aspect of the Italian campaign would you like to see covered in more detail? Let me know in the comments below. Remember those who fought, remember those who fell, and remember that freedom is never free. Until next time.